Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
I froze when Ethan's 5-year-old called me Grinch and said I ruined Christmas. Then Dad shrugged and said, maybe winners get Christmas and losers don't. At first, I thought it was a joke. One of those tasteless little family digs we always made around the holidays that never really stuck, like teasing each other for burned turkey or cheap wrapping paper. But when I looked around the table and saw my parents nodding, even chuckling like what he said made perfect sense, I realized something had shifted in my family. Something cold and permanent, like a steel beam driven between us. My nephew just looked up at me with wide eyes, as if he understood nothing about what he said, but everything about how he was being raised. I remember my heart thumping, and for a second, the sound of Christmas music in the background turned into white noise. All I could think was, how the hell did we get here? Growing up, Ethan and I were close, not in that Hallmark card kind of way, but we had a language. We knew how to communicate with just a look across the room at family gatherings, both of us silently mocking our father's rants about hard work and backbone, while our mother nodded like a backup singer to his chorus. We were survivors together. So when he married young and started a family, I became the unofficial emergency contact for everything: diapers, rent, gift money, even babysitting during their fights. I never minded. I didn't have kids of my own, and honestly, I liked the feeling of being useful, of being someone who made up for the fact that our own parents were never nurturing or generous, unless there was something in it for them. The thing is, every year, without fail, I helped Ethan make Christmas happen. I covered most of the gifts for his kids, pitched in for their tree and decorations, even paid for matching pajamas last year because his wife mentioned it during a casual phone call. I didn't think twice. It was tradition. And sure, I knew he wasn't the best with money, but I also knew that job stability had always been out of his reach. He took odd jobs, drove for delivery services, worked in warehouses. The guy never stopped moving, but somehow he always ended up back at zero. Still, we were family. That counted for something. This year felt different before it even started. There was tension in our group texts, fewer calls. Dad sent a group message mid-November saying, "We're scaling back Christmas this year. Let's keep it simple. Only winners get the spoils." I thought he was being ironic, that it was some reference I'd missed. But as the days ticked by and I asked if Ethan needed anything, he gave these vague answers like, "We're good," or "Parents said they'd take care of it." That's when I realized he wasn't just following Dad's lead. He was echoing it, almost proudly. It all came crashing down when I showed up with a box of early gifts and was met at the door by his wife, looking uncomfortable and clearly unprepared for visitors. Ethan came out holding the baby, who was wearing last year's Christmas onesie, and instead of the usual gratitude, I got this weird, smug look, like he was waiting for something. Then the kid called me Grinch, and I laughed at first, until I saw Ethan smirk and Dad laugh from the living room, where he sat with a beer and a bowl of peanuts like he owned the house. "Maybe winners get Christmas and losers don't," Dad said again, like it was some kind of family motto. I asked what the hell that meant, and Ethan just shrugged, saying, "You've done well for yourself, Mara. You should understand, it's survival of the fittest, isn't it?" That's when I realized I wasn't being cut out because I failed. I was being punished for succeeding, for not needing them. The irony burned. I had spent years helping, supporting, saving their holidays, and now, because I stopped handing out lifelines without question, I was being told I didn't understand the spirit of giving. So I left. I didn't cry, didn't scream, just walked out with the unopened gifts and drove straight home. The whole way I thought about how easily they turned on me, how Ethan had twisted Dad's ideology into something mean and self-serving. And that's when I remembered the account. See, for the past 2 years, I'd been quietly topping off a shared savings account that Ethan used to cover emergencies. He never asked how it got refilled, just assumed it was from our parents or some stroke of luck. But it was me. I did it because I wanted his kids to have a buffer, and I figured it wasn't my job to rub it in. That night, after the Grinch comment and my dad's smug laugh, I logged in, moved the funds into my personal account, and disabled access for Ethan. I didn't leave a note, didn't even change the password. I just shut the door on that part of our arrangement, cold and clean. 2 days later, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from Ethan, no pleasantries, just, "Hey, I got a weird message from the bank. Can you check it out? Something's not right." I didn't respond. I let the silence hang, just long enough for it to be felt, because that was the first move. If he wanted to play by the rules of winners and losers, then fine, we'd play. But he was about to learn something the hard way. The person who held your safety net doesn't always warn you when she walks away. For the first time in what felt like years, I slept through my alarm without guilt or anxiety gnawing at the back of my mind. And yet when I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, I felt no relief. Only this odd heaviness, like I had just pushed a boulder off a cliff and was waiting for the sound of it hitting the bottom. I made coffee without checking my phone, and I went the entire morning without opening the email account that had been silently managing the part of Ethan's life he apparently preferred to believe managed itself. I didn't know what kind of chaos I had set in motion by cutting him off, but I knew it was coming, and I had decided, at least for that day, to stop holding my breath for the impact. It was only when I walked past my kitchen table, still cluttered with wrapping paper and untouched gifts, that the guilt started to itch. The presents were supposed to go under their tree. I had bought things carefully: a book with Ethan's daughter's favorite character, a hand-knit scarf I paid extra to have personalized with her initials, a Lego set his son had circled in a catalog during Thanksgiving. Now they sat like little monuments to a truce that no longer existed, and I hated how something so small could make me feel so big and cold. Later that afternoon, I finally checked my messages, and there it was, another voicemail from Ethan. His voice didn't sound angry yet, not even panicked, just vaguely confused in a way that told me he hadn't put two and two together, but was beginning to suspect that I had something to do with the money disappearing. "Hey, Mara, bank said the backup funds didn't go through. Thought maybe you knew what's going on. Weird, right?" I deleted it before it finished. He wasn't worried yet, but he would be soon. I kept telling myself that he had made his choice, that standing next to Dad and throwing that smug look in my direction wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was alignment. He wasn't caught in the middle. He was playing a part he had chosen. And if that part meant dismissing me, minimizing me, and using me without thanks, then he could deal with the consequences, like the winner he claimed to be. But it didn't feel victorious. It felt hollow. And when a mutual friend messaged me saying, "Hey, did Ethan lose his bank backup? He told Jamie they're freaking out about gifts this year," I felt that familiar urge to fix things before they fell apart completely. But then I remembered what it had taken for me to stop. Not just years of bending over backwards, not just a child calling me a Grinch or a father laughing in my face, but the realization that I had built my own trap. I had made it easy for them to take me for granted because I had convinced myself that love was proven through sacrifice, and that sacrifice didn't need acknowledgement to matter. But acknowledgement does matter, especially when the people you're supporting have decided that your success is a reason to exclude you, not include you. A week passed, and while the messages slowed down, the silence began to swell into something denser, almost heavier than the words themselves. Then I got a text, not from Ethan, but from his wife, Nicole. "I know you're upset," she wrote, "but the kids are asking about you. They don't understand. Can we talk?" That should have been the moment where my resolve cracked, where I picked up the phone, apologized for my pride, and agreed to come over with presents and explanations. But something in her message rubbed me the wrong way. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't even acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, her husband and in-laws had gone too far. She just skipped to damage control, as though I were a problem to be managed, not a person who had been hurt. So I didn't respond. Instead, I did something I probably shouldn't have done, something I still have mixed feelings about. I opened the voice memo app on my phone, found the short recording I had made the day Dad and Ethan made their little "Christmases for Winners" speech, and I sent it. Not to Nicole, not to Ethan, but to Nicole's sister, Jamie, the same one who had messaged me earlier. No explanation, just the audio, just enough to show what was really going on behind closed doors, and to let the rest of her family hear the kind of thinking that had been shaping Ethan's household. I didn't expect fallout. I didn't do it for revenge, not exactly. I did it because I wanted someone, anyone, to say, "That's not right." And within a few hours, Jamie replied, "Holy hell, are you okay?" It was the first time in weeks someone asked that. Just that. Not what I could fix, not what I could offer, but how I was. The next day, Ethan texted again, this time with less charm, less pretense. "Your little stunt with Jamie just made things 10 times worse here. You want to talk?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the screen and thought, so now you're ready to talk? Now that your carefully curated house of cards is starting to wobble? I knew the kids were suffering, and part of me hated that. But I also knew that protecting them didn't have to mean enabling their father forever. And if Ethan wanted to talk, he'd have to do more than send a message. He'd have to listen, really listen, because I wasn't done yet. Not even close. There's something about silence after a storm that doesn't bring peace. It brings exposure. Every word that was shouted, every boundary that was crossed, it all just hangs there, suspended in the air like dust refusing to settle, and you're left standing in the middle of it, blinking and wondering if you were brave or just bitter. For days after I sent that recording to Jamie, I kept going over it in my head, trying to decide whether I'd crossed a line or finally drawn one. And the longer I sat with it, the more it became clear that I wasn't just dealing with Ethan's arrogance or our father's backwards moral compass. I was staring at the ruins of a role I had played for far too long, and now that I had walked away, I didn't know who I was to them anymore, or to myself, if I'm being honest. The first few days were strangely quiet, and that quiet carved out just enough space in my mind for memories to crawl in, one after another, uninvited and inconvenient. I remembered the time when I couldn't make rent, when I had just been laid off from a marketing firm that promised upward mobility but offered nothing more than burnout and free donuts on Fridays. Ethan had been the one to show up at my apartment with a $20 bill, a frozen pizza, and a bottle of cheap wine, saying, "It's not much, but I figured a bad day should at least taste better." It wasn't the money, it was the fact that he showed up, unasked, when no one else did. For a long time, that memory sat at the center of how I saw him. Not perfect, not even reliable all the time, but someone who tried when it mattered. But now I couldn't stop comparing that Ethan to the man who had stood there, shoulder to shoulder with our father, using his child as a pawn in some weird morality play where money equaled virtue and needing help meant you didn't deserve it. It felt like I was grieving someone who hadn't died, but had definitely disappeared. And in his place was this cold calculation I didn't recognize. And still, the guilt whispered. Not because I regretted taking back control of the finances, or even for exposing his smug cruelty to his extended family, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the kids, those little faces who had no idea what any of this meant, who were probably just confused about why the woman who always brought the good cookies and asked about school wasn't showing up anymore. I didn't want to punish them. I just didn't know how to separate them from him without reopening the very door I had finally shut. My phone rang one afternoon while I was folding laundry, a task I suddenly found oddly therapeutic in its simplicity. It was my mother, and I let it ring twice before answering, already bracing myself for some passive-aggressive comment disguised as concern. "Mara," she said, her voice tight and formal, like she was calling a distant acquaintance. "Your father and I are very concerned about how things are unraveling between you and your brother. This whole situation is beginning to reflect poorly on the family. Not a word about the recording. Not a single question about how I was doing. Just concern for appearances and reputation." I stayed quiet for a moment, waiting for something resembling empathy, but when it didn't come, I said, "You're worried about reflections when the mirror is already cracked," and hung up before she could pretend to misunderstand. That night, I lay awake thinking about whether I had become them, whether my retaliation, while justified, had tipped into cruelty. I didn't want to become the cold enforcer of justice, doling out pain in equal measure because I could. I wanted Ethan to understand, not just that what he did was wrong, but that it mattered. That cutting me off, aligning with Dad's philosophy of conditional love, had consequences that reached beyond bank accounts. Still, part of me needed to make it undeniably clear that I wasn't bluffing. So I did something I had hesitated to do before. I called in a favor from a friend who worked in financial services, someone I had helped a few years back during her divorce, someone who owed me one and knew the ropes well enough to offer insight without crossing legal lines. I asked her to look into Ethan's setup, not his main bank account, but any secondary assets, any new accounts, or suspicious transfers. What she found didn't surprise me, but it still stung. 3 months prior, Ethan had opened a separate account under a different name, presumably for a side hustle he hadn't told anyone about. A decent amount of money had flowed through it, enough to suggest that while he was publicly crying poverty and leaning on my charity, he'd been sitting on an emergency fund of his own that he never mentioned, not even when I was picking up the tab for his grocery runs or slipping cash into his kids' stockings. I stared at the screenshots for a long time, a fresh wave of anger rising in my throat. It wasn't just about money, it was about lies. About letting me believe I was his only hope while secretly protecting himself from the very chaos he claimed to be drowning in. I wanted to call him, to yell, to ask how he justified any of this, but instead I logged into my own accounts, the ones still legally tied to the support web I had built for his family, and I initiated a security review that would put a temporary freeze on transfers related to the address I had once listed as shared emergency contact. It wasn't permanent. It wasn't even punitive. It was just enough to make things inconvenient, enough to send a message. Less than 48 hours later, Ethan called. No voicemail this time, just a text. They locked the account. I don't know how I'm getting to tomorrow. There was no pretense, no murk, just that raw sentence, plain and fragile. And for a brief second, I felt it. That old instinct to rush in, fix it, solve everything with a phone call and a wire transfer. But then I remembered every moment he had stood silently while I was belittled. Every moment he had let the narrative shift from thank you to we deserve this. And I knew he wasn't at tomorrow yet, but I wasn't ready to take him there. Not until he started walking on his own. There are moments in life when the unraveling of someone else's carefully constructed narrative doesn't bring the satisfaction you expected. Not because the person doesn't deserve the fall, but because once you start to see them stumble and flail, you're confronted with the unsettling realization that this was never about a single incident or a misunderstood comment. It was about years of quiet deception, subtle manipulation, and a shared delusion that somehow family loyalty was a one-way street where only some people carried the load while others just got to ride in the cart. And as I watched Ethan's situation spiral in real time, mostly through indirect updates and whispered conversations that came back to me through mutual friends and acquaintances, I felt a strange mix of vindication and nausea that settled into my chest like a weight that refused to shift no matter how I tried to distract myself. The first real signal that things were falling apart faster than even I had anticipated came not from Ethan himself, who had gone mostly silent since the short, defeated text about the frozen account, but from Nicole, his wife, who posted what seemed like a vague, overly polished holiday photo on her social media, with the kind of caption that tries a little too hard to say, "We're fine," while the eyes in the photo told a different story entirely. The kids weren't smiling, not really. They had the kind of blank stares that kids get when they know something is wrong, but no one will tell them exactly what it is. And the tree behind them was half decorated, clearly rushed, with the top leaning awkwardly to the side, as if it couldn't quite bear the weight of whatever star or ribbon they'd tried to affix there. That same day, a co-worker of mine mentioned, casually over coffee, that her cousin had recently declined to move forward with a candidate for a mid-level warehouse management position because the guy missed a simple verification call and let a paperwork deadline lapse. I knew immediately it had to be Ethan. He'd mentioned applying to that same company months ago, and it was the kind of role he could have done well in if he had been focused, prepared, and not consumed by whatever chaos he'd allowed to seep into every corner of his life. Hearing it secondhand, hearing that he had likely lost a legitimate chance at stabilizing his income because he couldn't keep up with basic logistics, made me realize just how much he had been relying on the invisible scaffolding I'd built for him over the years. Without my quiet hand guiding the background operations, reminding him of deadlines, transferring money for last-minute emergencies, offering a soft place to land, he was floundering not because he was incapable, but because he had never truly learned how to be accountable without the safety net I had become. And yet, as much as part of me wanted to feel triumphant, to believe that justice was being served in the form of late fees and missed opportunities, I couldn't stop thinking about the kids. They were collateral in a war they didn't start, and as I pictured their small, confused faces, I realized I couldn't just sit back and watch the house burn without at least opening one window. I wasn't ready to unlock the door and let Ethan back in, but I could do something small, something that wouldn't absolve him, but would at least shield the innocent from the fallout. So I called in a favor, not a direct one, not even in my name, but through a charity I had supported for years that specialized in holiday relief for struggling families. I gave them an address, a wish list, cleverly compiled through old conversations and social media stalking, and enough money to cover toys, winter clothes, and even a few indulgent items like a new tablet and a musical keyboard that I remembered Ethan's daughter once obsessing over. I made it anonymous. I didn't want credit. I didn't want a thank you. I just wanted them to have something to hold on to, something bright and good that didn't carry the weight of adult mistakes. It felt like the right kind of revenge, one that hit where it needed to, but spared the ones who didn't deserve the blow. 3 days later, the delivery was made, and though I tried not to, I watched from my car parked down the block, heart pounding as the box-laden truck pulled into their driveway, and Nicole stepped out with a look that was equal parts confusion and exhaustion. Ethan appeared a minute later, holding his son, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something I hadn't expected. Tears. Not the performative kind, not the manipulative kind, but the kind that sneak up on you when you're overwhelmed and scared and suddenly reminded that good things can still happen, even when you're convinced you don't deserve them anymore. He looked around, scanning the street as if trying to find the invisible hand that had done this, and for 1 second, our eyes met. He didn't know I was in the car, couldn't have, but it felt like he saw me anyway, like he felt me watching and understood, in that brief, flickering moment, that this was my message. Not a punishment, not a surrender, but a pause, a choice. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't text, didn't call, just stood there, holding his child and blinking away what looked like shame. And that was enough for me, for now, because real consequences don't always come in the form of locked accounts and burned bridges. Sometimes they come in the form of silence, of unexpected grace, of realizing the safety net you took for granted wasn't a right. It was a gift, one you might never get back. But what he didn't know, and what I wasn't ready to tell him yet, was that the final reckoning hadn't come. The window was open, sure, but the door, that stayed shut. Because the next move, that one would be mine. It's a strange kind of quiet when someone who once filled every corner of your life with need, constant, unspoken, assumed need, finally stops asking, not because they don't want help anymore, but because they've either resigned themselves to managing without you or, more dangerously, are trying to maneuver their way back in without addressing the wreckage left behind. The silence after the delivery, after Ethan stood in his driveway with that look on his face, that look that flickered between disbelief, gratitude, and something dangerously close to regret, lasted exactly 72 hours before the dam broke. Not through some emotional monologue or apology that acknowledged what had been said and done, but through a voicemail so tentative, so painfully unsure of itself, that it felt like listening to someone walk barefoot across shattered glass, not sure which shard would cut deepest. "Hey, Mara. I don't know where to start, so I guess I'll just say that I saw what you did, or at least what I think you did. Nicole and I, we didn't expect that. The kids, well, they haven't stopped playing since, and I've been thinking about everything. Maybe we should talk before it all slips further than it already has. There was no mention of the bank account, no mention of the recording or the shameful philosophy our parents had broadcast like it was some universal truth. No direct apology, not even a real explanation, just the word talk, dangled like bait. And while the version of me from a few months ago might have jumped at that, clung to it like a lifeline, I had changed. I wasn't looking for crumbs anymore. I wasn't desperate for acknowledgement. If we were going to talk, it wasn't going to be a detour on his road to redemption. It was going to be a full stop. A reckoning, a moment where everything got laid bare, even if neither of us walked away feeling victorious. So I didn't call him back. I didn't text. I sat down, opened the Notes app on my phone, and wrote out everything I needed to say, without smoothing the edges or dousing the flame. I started with the memory of the $20 bill and frozen pizza, because I wanted him to know that I remembered, that I hadn't erased the good just because the bad had followed. I acknowledged how grateful I had been for that support in my darkest moments, but I also told him, point blank, that what hurt more than anything was not the money I had spent or the energy I had poured into keeping his family afloat. It was realizing that, when given the choice between loyalty to a sibling who had carried him for years and the validation of a father who had always measured worth in output, he had chosen the latter without even blinking. I told him how humiliating it was to stand in his house and be mocked, how devastating it felt to see his child parrot back cruel things I had never taught them, things I would never say about family, even when I was at my most furious. I told him about the account, about every quiet transfer I had made, about every bill I had covered without ceremony, and how each of those gestures had once come from love, but over time had turned into a leash he hadn't even noticed because he was too busy convincing himself that he was surviving on grit alone. I reminded him that cutting him off wasn't done out of spite, but out of necessity, because I had spent so long propping up his life that I had started losing sight of my own. And then I did something that surprised even me. I made a proposal, not an olive branch, but an ultimatum. I told him that I was willing to sit down, face to face, and talk, really talk, with no interruptions and no emotional shortcuts, but only if he agreed to invite our parents too. Not because I wanted them there, but because I needed him to see the system he had bought into for what it truly was: ugly, conditional, manipulative, and I needed them to hear what their philosophy of only winners get Christmas had done to their children. How it had fractured something so deep between us that even now, with time and distance, the wound hadn't closed. I told him I wouldn't come to the house. If the meeting happened, it would be in neutral territory, somewhere public, somewhere with windows and coffee and the kind of lighting that makes it hard to lie to yourself. I ended with one final line, one I had rehearsed in my head 100 times, but never said aloud. I'll open the doors, but only if we all look in the mirror. Then I hit send. The next day passed in a blur, no response, no reply. I tried not to check my phone every hour, but my curiosity betrayed me. I wasn't waiting for validation. I was waiting for confirmation that he was still capable of doing the hard thing, the uncomfortable thing, the thing that required humility. And then, just after noon on the second day, I got a text from Ethan, short, measured. They agreed. Thursday, 3 o'clock, the cafe near the library. I'll be there. I hope you will too. I stared at it for a long time, the words swimming slightly as my vision blurred with a mix of anxiety and relief. Because no matter how it ended, no matter what was said or left unsaid, this was the moment the narrative shifted. No longer me on the outside, no longer them controlling the story. Now it was my table, my terms. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the start of something better. Not perfect, not tidy, but real. Or maybe it would be the end. I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing for certain. This time, I wouldn't be backing down.